So, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our writer dialogue between Isabel Fargo Cole and Naomi Ayala. My name is Raleigh Joyner. I am the Goethe-Institut Cultural Programs Coordinator. I sit here in Washington, D.C., and I'm currently broadcasting from Tacoma Park, Maryland. I am joined today by two great writers, one who is based in Germany, one who is based here in Washington, D.C. And this has been kind of a long time coming, so we're really glad that we've finally been able to get everybody together into this space, even if it is a virtual space. That's still great, and really glad that we've been able to do this as actually our final, for Goethe-Institut Washington, at least, our final event of 2021. Um, and just as a little bit of a background as to how this event sort of came together, usually around, it depends. It's happened at different times throughout the year over the course of this project, but together with the Goethe-Institut in New York and the Goethe-Institut in Chicago, we in Washington do a project as part of this larger festival called Festival Neue Literatur, which brings German language writers to the United States for various workshops, dialogues, and readings, and audience engagement, networking opportunities. And we do this together with the Embassy of Switzerland, as well as the Austrian Cultural Forum. And different writers get sort of grouped up and sent to Washington, to Chicago. Usually they start out in New York. And so these this particular group of writers in which Isabel was a part of, actually, I think what they started to round everybody up in 2019. And then they were originally going to come to the United States in spring of 2020. And so we have been working with these writers for a long time. So we're glad that we've been able to bring Isabel and her conversation partner, who is DC-based poet Naomi Ayala, together today. And I will pass this over to the curator of the local program, which is called Zeitgeist, to Suzanne Zweizig, who sort of identified Naomi as a great conversation partner for Isabel. And Suzanne will introduce our writers as well as our moderator, Amanda Sheffer. So thanks a lot, Suzanne. I'll let you take it over.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Good evening, good morning, depending where you are. We have that privilege of being able to cross time zones here in this virtual format. Yeah, it's really a thrill to be able to bring these two writers together and together with our moderator. I'm not going to go too extensively into their detailed bios. I'll tell you a little bit about each of them, but I want to focus on the sort of unique aspects of their writing and their approach to their life and writing that I think make them interesting partners to bring into this conversation together. I'll start with Isabel Fargo Cole, who, and I just want to wave Isabel so they know who you are. Who is the writer we're bringing from Germany today. And when I was introduced to the idea that Isabel would come, she was immediately interesting to me because she is a novelist who was born in America, moved to Germany, and after about 10 years living in Germany, she started writing in German. So her first novel was published in German, Die Grüne Grenze, The Green Frontier, which we'll be talking a little bit about today. And she has a second novel out now in German. And the interesting thing to me about that was what courage and curiosity and it took to sort of cross those boundaries, to cross the language boundary, the cultural boundary. And her writing does embody that a little bit, the exploration of space and frontiers and how those crossing those challenge, our ways of knowing, our ways of speaking, our ways of thinking, even, sort of existential issues too. So I'm really thrilled she could be here. And when I was trying to think who to pair her with, because one of the things we like to do in Zeitgeist is not just to bring the readers here to read their work, but to engage in the community in some way. So we've been, wanting to pair them with local writers and with the community. And I thought, well, who, because her writing is about, her book is ostensibly about, the topic is, the East Germany and that time in German history. So I was like, well, nobody in DC is writing about that. Who would I pair with? But once we started thinking about the cross language and the cross boundary things, it became really clear that some of our bilingual writers, would be dealing with some of the same things, and very interesting. And then it was very, very, my first choice immediately popped into my mind was Naomi Ayala, who is one of my favorite DC-based poets. And Naomi has had her own journey of crossing boundaries and exploring in between spaces. She was born in the mainland US, raised in Puerto Rico, and then moved back to the mainland US in her teens, and her writing is also bilingual. Sometimes within the same poem, she'll do between Spanish and English. And it's been thrilling to talk to her a little bit about how that fluidity between language kind of shapes her way of thinking about the world. And I'm really excited to see the two of them engage together in this discussion. I'm going to turn it over to them in a minute, but before, I just want to introduce Amanda, who's going to be our moderator. Amanda is associate professor of German at Catholic University, and she's been a friend of the Goethe-Institut for a while. She organizes the Goethe-Institut's book clubs, and she'll be moderating the discussion then. So I'm going to go ahead and mute and turn it over to our writers. I'll turn it over to Naomi and Isabel. So enjoy, everyone. And there'll be time for questions and answers at the end from the audience too. I'll just say that. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Hello, Isabel. Very nice to meet you. I thought I had planned a different start, but after this introduction, I wonder if maybe we could start talking about that, about migration and crossing those boundaries, because they're so multi-layered and affect our thinking and our behavior and the way we evolve in different ways. So for me, when I moved to the United States, I had no recollection of the United States when I was growing up in Puerto Rico, because I was brought back home at 1.5 years old. But returning here to the United States, to the mainland, poetry for me, I continued to write in Spanish all throughout, but poetry for me was a way to learn English. My English teachers immediately zeroed in on the fact, oh, the woman's been writing already. This will be a good connect. So I wonder for you what this experience was like, if you could talk a little bit about writing in second language. How did it, I know I read that you were immersed in all things German at the beginning and spoke less English. What was your how did your relationship with the writing in a second language change?
Yeah, first of all, I think it's really interesting what you said about this idea of writing literature as a way of learning language. I think that's something that, in language learning, that's something that could be used more often to kind of free people up to play with the language, even at a lower level. For me, it was, I had a lot of German in high school. I had it all through high school with a German teacher who was very focused on, having us do spontaneous dialogues and reading real literature as soon as we could. So she really had that aspect in there. And then I came to Germany in 1995 to Berlin and really kind of immersed myself. I was really interested in East Berlin and this kind of East Germany, this sort of East German world that opened up. So yeah, I was basically, for about the first 7 years I was there, I was kind of I was living in German, and I had also written since my childhood. So I was writing, but I was writing in English. And at some point I was writing more and more about these, the stories I was hearing from my East German friends and this kind of whole East German past issue. And I was writing about that in English. And at some point it became weird to write about this experience in English. I kind of felt like I was translating in a way. And there would be a lot of words that I had trouble, that you can't, for very specific historical experiences relating to unification and so forth of Germany, that you can't say as easily in English. You'd have to kind of explain it. And so when I was kind of grappling with these stories and wanting to kind of turn them into literary stories, it kind of pushed me more and more in the direction of wanting to just stick with the German of the material that I was working with. And then there was this other aspect, which was that I started trying to get into literary translation. And so translating, discovering German books and wanting to translate them. And when you, as I'm sure you know, as a translator, when you kind of delve into the language that you're translating from, you realize all these things that you can do in German that you can't do in English, or that you can do in Spanish that you can't do in English. And with German, I kind of kept thinking, oh, there's all this cool stuff you can do in German that you can't do in English. I want to do that too. I want to use this for writing. I want to play with this. And so that was kind of one impetus that started me, from the kind of the language level, as opposed to the level of the subject material, that kind of just sort of naturally pushed me toward writing in German. And also I was just, at that time, life was more analog. So I had some friends in the US that I would, we would read each other's stories and stuff, and, give each other criticism. But when I went to find a literary community in Berlin, it was a German language community. So I wanted to participate in it, and, that. And then I kind of thought, well, why not write in German and just, give it a shot? And people were encouraging. And so, yeah, it just kind of came together.
It was the language of the place, so it feels organic. It feels natural.
Yeah.
I have a follow-up to that. I wonder, I've observed that for myself, while continuing to write in Spanish and English, I'll write about completely different things in each language. So I don't necessarily pursue my same thematic concerns in each language. And I wonder if, I think you were recently working on essays. Is that correct? If you write both in German, also, if you write in English at all, if you have any experience about going to English differently and going into German differently. I know that the German, you've said, is more grounded in details that have to do with history and that, sociopolitical context, and you're there. So that kind of makes sense. But what about English? Is there a difference? Do you write in it, and what is it like?
I have to say, I actually write less in English now, just because kind of my publishing network is German based. So I don't have as many opportunities to write in English as maybe I would like. And it's just, I've been focused more on the things that I have to write in German. So I've really kind of, sometimes I've translated things I've written in German into English, shorter pieces. And then I can kind of play with different possibilities of the language, or kind of maybe even change the content a little bit. So in a way, I'm kind of out of the habit of writing in English, except that translation is all, I translate into English, which is also kind of like writing in a way. But it's sort of, I think, I also have the experience, not from writing, but just from how I live with my two languages, that English for me is kind of associated with different subjects or with a different time. And German is associated with a different time in my life. There are, certain things that I could only really say in German, just kind of like whatever, sort of certain kinds of screws or something that you might use to fix your house, because I never had to do that when I was a kid, and, having to take care of my household in the US. So there's kind of like different life phases, I think, are associated with different languages for me, but that doesn't quite go into my writing so much. I do kind of have the issue if I write now, the book I'm working on now actually has to do with my American family history. And I've been finding that difficult a bit because I'm kind of coming from this English language material and trying to put it in German. And then it's kind of like going against the grain in a bit. Yeah, not sure if that answered your question, but it's kind of.
Yes, absolutely it does. I was curious about it. And so it seems you have a similar experience in terms of associating it with different parts of who you are, your identity and your timeline as a person, your development as a person. Along those lines, I also wondered about translation. I read an interview with you for World Literature today, in which you spoke about translating your own work. And so this is something I do. And I love that translation / composition process, because you get to take these liberties with your own work and sort of like step back and understand yourself, like your thinking process and your writing process, with a little bit of detachment, as though you were an outsider, to make that translation possible. And at the same time, where you have the stucknesses and the things that you can translate culturally, taking liberties that a translator normally wouldn't. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that process, because in my mind, I see it. I've translated 2 novels and kind of prefer that for the sake of continuity. Translating poetry is challenging in a different way. But so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. I was curious what that's like for a novelist in this different, it's outside of my scope of understanding.
Yeah. I've translated. Is the sound a little bit weird, or is it okay now? Okay, it's okay. Yeah, I've only translated of my 2 novels. Of each novel, I translated kind of a sample for my publisher to use in foreign rights, and so that's what's in the reader. That I don't know if the viewers have it, but that we shared of each other's work, and so it was interesting, especially with this novel, The Green Frontier, because it is kind of this very East German rooted novel. It's set in East Germany in the 70s and 80s. It's a very specific historic situation. And so that's kind of what I wrote in German, so that I wouldn't have to think about how to say everything in English. And then with the translation, I did have to think about it. And it was kind of interesting to see, in the translation, that I did have the freedom to say, okay, I'm going to try to explain things a little bit more, or maybe, leave this thing out or that thing out that would be kind of too, take too much space or get in the way to explain. So that was interesting. And I kind of thought that I kind of could imagine that if I were to translate the entire novel, that I would kind of really rewrite a lot of things in a different, or maybe I would take a different perspective on the novel, because it kind of has sort of an implicit outside perspective too, because I didn't feel that I could, as an outsider, sort of write an authentic East German novel that wouldn't kind of reflect on my distance from the subject material. So if I were to put that into English, I could kind of find a different strategy for that would kind of reflect the distance in the language that I was using.
Thank you. In reading the reader for The Green Frontier, one of the things that jumped out at me the most was how, I thought this is not a novelist, this is a poet's lens. I was really observed, yes, because I thought in terms of, choices, the way the narrative is scattered, fragmented and scattered through. There's like a alliterative effect going on. I was like, this is a translation. There's a rhythm that comes through in the translation. So And then there's this magical, for me, writing in between the lines that you do so adeptly. And I hadn't quite experienced that in reading a novel recently. So I wondered, how you came into writing novels, and I wondered why this genre? Because for me, you read like a poet. Yeah.
That's a really great compliment coming from you, so I really appreciate that. Yeah, I guess I've never tried writing poetry. It's just kind of, yeah, I really am in awe of people who can do that. I think with a novel, it's more forgiving because you have a plot and that carries people along, and everything isn't riding on every single line. But the language is really important for me, and the images. So, that things work on the level of language and metaphors and turns of phrase, that is important to me. But I guess I am kind of more of a novelistic reader. I really like this experience of kind of diving into a world, that a novel can kind of create a whole world that you can move around in for hours or kind of come back to again and again. And that was what also I found fascinating writing a novel. And I worked on this thing for years and years and years and years and got fell down way too many rabbit holes of research and obscure facts and so forth. But it is kind of part of the pleasure for me is kind of accumulating all these different materials and kind of putting them together in a kind of a big thing that you can immerse yourself in, but then also having the language be something hopefully that kind of pulls you in and lets you kind of sink into this world. And that was also important for me at the beginning of the novel, to kind of give people hopefully a sense of immediacy in this very, to them, probably exotic East German locale of this little town right next to the border. So it was important for me to kind of use sort of sensual language and strong images to make this kind of come to life, and also to kind of push back against, people kind of have a cliched image of East Germany, that everything was gray and everyone was kind of, sort of numb and sort of robotically going around their gray lives and so forth. And of course, a lot of it was gray, but people, were just as alive as we were, and they were, enjoying the spring and so forth, and having their daily lives and their daily pleasures and so forth. And I wanted to kind of give a sense of that with the language.
I love that about it. That was a strong pull for me. It hooked me right away. So and central to that, for me, to my experience as a reader, were those images. And so the visual detail. So whether it's like the way a corner looked or a reflection, and I thought, oh, look at this. And I'm wondering, oh, is this going to be part of the narrative as it's evolving? Is this, part of this character's development? But it helped give me a sense of time and place in a different way. And I prefer the visual of the senses in writing. Definitely have a bias in that direction. This interested me to such a degree that I wondered if what influences this in your writing. I wondered if visual art in any way informs your work, or an interest in it. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, sure. I think maybe I should keep it short, because then I have to switch around to putting you in the spotlight. Yeah, I guess I am kind of more of a visual person, and when I think, yeah, I do have certain maybe kind of artworks in mind, but I think one thing, and maybe I can kind of transition to one of the questions I wanted to ask you, is for me, landscape and natural surroundings are really important, and kind of evoking those and kind of looking at the geography and the ecosystems that people are moving in. And that also for me is kind of part of the visual setting of a novel or a scene or whatever. And to kind of segue to this question that I wanted to ask you, as I was really interested to see that you are also very engaged in environmental subjects. And so I was curious, your poems in the reader are very, they're very urban. They're very like these very vivid kind of encounters and, you know, dialogues or scenes that seem very taken out of urban life. And I understand that, or I found some other of your poems online that are more focused on natural subjects. And so I was kind of wanting to ask generally how you combine your interests, your environmental interests with writing, and what that means for your poetry.
Thank you. Yes, there's usually in like the more urban poems, there's usually the natural world shows up as a motif or a trope. For me, I grew up in right next to a rainforest, and I spent an incredible amount of time outdoors. And so it gives my world an orientation, and it's also what I consider my mother. The natural world is my sustaining force spiritually and very literally, all of us really. But in terms of my the indigenous roots parts of my culture, there's a reverence for it, a respect that informs all I am. So it sometimes manifests in poems in this way or that. And it's interesting to me how it shows up. So I have fascinations that don't make it into writing. Like this fall, I've taken to collecting the leaves of all the trees. In my immediate area, so in about 1.5 mile radius. And, you know, DC is also known as the city of trees. We have all kinds of varieties of trees here. And then, you know, learning about them individually and being able to tell them by the leaf alone and drawing them and then writing about the tree. And so this isn't necessarily things people are into reading about all the time, but it definitely informs my sensibility as a poet. So sense of place for me, as somebody who was displaced at a critical time in her life, it wasn't my choice to come back to the mainland. It's what grounds me immediately. So I go back to the visual. Where are we? What's going on? What's, you know, where's the location of this and that? And it orients me in time and space immediately. So the natural world kind of plays all those roles for me. You know, I hope that in some way I could someday help other people who may not have an appreciation and respect for it, develop it. It's been critical for a long time, and it's now, you know, coming to a critical.
Yeah. No, it's really interesting what you say about the natural world being something that grounds you, or something that you could kind of maybe carry from Puerto Rico to the US and kind of hold on to. And I thought it was really interesting how you used natural imagery in some of these urban poems, like this image of the hummingbirds for the people on the food line, and that really kind of gave the scene, this kind of everyday scene, this kind of dignity or this special aura to it, with this connection to these birds, and that did seem to give it a kind of a grounding. Yeah. Maybe I will. Maybe we covered this already, but of course, I also wanted to ask you about, you know, how bilingualism plays into your writing, and also how translation how translation interacts with your writing. I think maybe you already maybe you already covered this in what you said before, but I was wondering if there's anything else that you might maybe wanted to expand on, or that came to mind about that.
Sure. Now it's more permissible to use words from a foreign language that's not like Latin or Greek, for example, and get creative with it, and have a general audience be more forgiving of the fact that they may be displaced and may need to read the text to look something up, right? That didn't used to be the case. So I used to take liberties with poems, borrowing from Spanish and interweaving, so that if you were bilingual, you could read a poem and understand it without having to think about the language itself, even though it was a poem. And so this fascinated me for years doing this. And of course, I couldn't find homes for any of these poems. So I stopped doing that and pursuing other interests. And so now I take more liberties with lines. If it feels right, I don't like to force it. Sometimes they come to me that way. There's something about the spirit of the poem or the experience that kind of calls for it, and it rises to the surface for me. And then, you know, in Spanish, the challenge is probably like a similar challenge to what you may face writing in English in another country where it's not the main language spoken, that, you know, Spanish is spoken so much here. So, but in terms of publication, you know, that there's work that sits around that hasn't found a home. And so that I share with friends and readings and events and all that. So I feel, you know, that work is being heard. So I kind of flip back and forth, and then most of my effort goes into English because people will ask for writing, or, you know, the books I've published, the 3 are in English here. So yeah, so I always feel like I'm a different person when I'm translating. I'm a different person when I'm writing in English or Spanish or doing something bilingual. So it's like, what, you know, hat will I put on? And how does this fit my creative pullings lately? Is this where my mind is at in terms of my creative thinking? And then I'll get pulled in that direction.
So I'm curious, when you translate yourself, what kind of liberties do you find yourself taking? Would it kind of be like, you know, the sound, that kind of the sound of the language, maybe the different language pulls you in a different way, or that you can kind of try out a different poetic identity, or
sound. I have to say that as a poet, sound is you know, outside of content. It is a part of content. So sound for me, so I'll end up having different tweaking so that I can accommodate a sound in English that wouldn't be there, but making different choices would alter the meaning and then take it in a different direction. And because, you know, with writing poetry, you're writing is literally what you're writing now, and then you're also inferring meaning. So it changes, you know, literally what somebody may get on face by looking at it, and then what you're also might be inferring. It changes what you're inferring. So there's all these layers going on. So yeah, I'll take liberties. If something sounds awful, and Spanish is, you know, the Romance languages are very lyrical. They have a tendency toward the lyrical. So, you know, translating into English is always this uncomfortable, like, where's the sound? Where did all the sound go? So the first tweaking would lead me in that direction. And so my choices will be trying to, and, you know, sound affects tone. So I think even when you don't read it aloud, when I don't read poems aloud, when I read other people's work, sound is ever present with me too. The way, you know, line breaks, you know, that hard stop or soft stops, and how they influence rhythm, how a poem moves toward to closing, you know, it's part of the poem itself. It's all this major orchestration.
And I'm also curious, as kind of a sub question maybe, is how do you, if you were, I mean, in some of the poems in the reader, you were playing with the switch between English and Spanish, and the Spanish was a voice. It was a certain voice of a certain person, a very specific, you know, that said something about their, you know, their social situation or their background. And I'm wondering, is it difficult for you to translate those kind of poems that play with that break between English and Spanish? Do you have to find a kind of a different solution for that?
Yeah, I don't always translate them. I try to capture nowadays the essence of them in these particular poems, excuse me. There were speakers' voices. And so to have heard them in English, I thought would have taken away from the poem.
Yeah.
I thought hearing the Spanish, even if a reader didn't know Spanish, would help, you know, capture that person, would add to, you know, the authenticity of their voice and exactly how they would say something that's so simple, but how they would say it. And staying faithful to that was like the most important thing. So, and I think in these cases, you know, it was so appropriate to have somebody think, you know, you're passing by a food line, and if you ask, you know, the food line poem, this woman's, you know, main concern was to make sure that I felt welcome to also join the food line, and that she would also save me a spot, and that I could come tomorrow and I would be welcome. And so, you know, that spirit of somebody being in such a dire situation, and their natural inclination is to welcome others and make sure that they also don't go without. So it had to be in the original Spanish.
I guess for my last question, I found this really great quote in this interview with you that I found online, where you you gave this advice to, I'm just looking it up. You said, draw closer to those who seem to have harmonized or are harmonizing the various facets of who they are in their writing, sure, but most importantly, in their lives. And I found that really intriguing, this idea of being drawn to people who are kind of harmonizing different things. And I was curious if you could say, what kind of different facets do you try to harmonize in your life or in your writing?
I you know, I'm somebody who is studying Dogen right now, and Buddhism is a part of my life, and you know, part of a local sangha. I write in Spanish, I write in English, I translate, I write, but I'm also a technical writer and technical translator and do that for a living. And so there's all these different environments and different parts of my brain and my heart that are involved, and they don't always intersect. And so, and I love to learn anything new. I love to always be learning something. And so, you know, I think the more we harmonize all these different parts, they are who we are anyway, rather than compartmentalize them into boxes, which turns to be the perfect time management solution, right? So how can you be more of who you are, regardless of the circumstances, rather than, oh, this is the time for work, this has no relevance in the sphere. And, you know, I think I'm a happier person when I'm able to do that, or at least if not always happier, more fulfilled. And, you know, probably that thinking comes from not wanting to be defined, you know. And as a young woman and a young woman on my own in this country where I was told left and right everywhere, and in my own country, you should be this, you do that, you know. At 18, I was told that I needed to start thinking about marriage right away and having children. And you have to have children because they'll take care of you when you're old. And I would look and think, that's a ridiculous idea. And so having that, to be able to stand my ground on my own, like, you know, and being a Puerto Rican and being from a colonized country and what that meant to me. And so, but I didn't want to be defined in any way. I wanted to find the expression of who I was, because that's just what felt like I came here to do, to be as fully who I was as a person as possible, while helping others do the same in whatever way I could. So that's why that's important to me. I probably said, I don't even remember when I said it. Yeah.
No.
Well, thank you both for that very interesting discussion. And I really enjoyed some of the concepts that we've touched on already, especially looking at the role of language, or even the notion of a second language, what it means to be at home in that, and also environmental topics, and this key notion of orientation and trying to get through spaces. And what really strikes me about both of your work is that it's so focused on geography. There's some stories that can take place anywhere. You can just move the characters around, but yours are very rooted to the areas that they're told. And so often I find that they want to describe things in terms of the nation state. So this is a German story, or this is an American story, or you're an American who lives in Germany, or what does it mean to have this especially unique relationship between Puerto Rico and the United States, you know, how it merges together, but is also very separate and distinct. But I was wondering how you might position your work as also something more geolocalized. So for instance, in the Green Frontier, we specifically talk about the Harz. And that has a lot of cultural inclinations. You know, immediately think of Goethe when you're in literature, or Naomi, when you talk about Columbia Heights in your work, and the specific area that when most people think of DC, this isn't the first area that they come to think about in this community. So how do you see, or how do you position your work, both within the national contexts or within the much more geolocalized regions? So I don't know if Isabel, if you want to start.
Sure. Yeah, I guess I'm kind of fascinated by the idea of just kind of digging into one place. So my novel is set in this very tiny little town, this real little backwater, where you'd think there's absolutely nothing of interest, and the main character is kind of stuck there. And he starts to kind of look into the history of it, and he can't get out. He's very confined because it's right behind the border of East Germany that he can't cross. So he kind of dives down and keeps uncovering these different layers of history, and it's kind of an escape. But it's just also kind of a fascination that I have with history, and just to kind of look at some place. And I also have this tendency to fall down rabbit holes of research. So I just find that if I look at if you look at any particular place, you can kind of, you know, open it up and go down, keep going deeper and deeper and deeper, and finding what it's connected to, and you know, finding an entire world and whatever little place you happen to live in, and then also looking at how it's connected with broader, you know, the broader macrocosm and so forth.
And I can say it's the same for me. I think, you know, in speaking about the particulars and capturing that story, like the story of the women at the food line, you capture the story of other people going through the same thing in this country and elsewhere. So that moment in time, you know, and the history of that moment in time, and that church in particular, nature and the neighborhood itself. And, I love how Isabel does this with your work, Isabel, and how you're concerned with the layers of history and how they influence the present. So for me, I can explore it in a poem the way one would in a novel, but in series of poems I can. And so that's also a concern of mine.
And what I love about the juxtaposition of poems, it's the series and the way that they're ordered and presented within each other in a collection itself. So I think that's an interesting advantage that poetry also can take on the novel sometimes too. But I think if I would be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about the emotions that are thematized within your work. I mean, it's very deeply emotional on a lot of levels, so much so that it becomes the symbolism. So in both your work, either in German, Elend is a word that's used a lot. It's, comes up in character names. It comes up in the name of a town itself. And Naomi, you also use the word sorrow in your poetry as well. And you also reference the heart that you bring into your poetry. So I'm wondering how you decide what type of emotions that speak to you when you're writing and how you want to thematize them within the larger construction of your project, whether this is this cultural historical type of novel, or if it's something more socially focused, like a lot of your poetry, Naomi.
For me, I don't think about the emotion first. I guess the sensory stuff pulls me in, and then understanding, that moment in time, what's happening right now and what's informing that moment. But what attracts me is being able to, and this is something that, I hope to continue trying till I transition, that capturing, that sorrow juxtaposed with that beauty that is there, all exists at the same time, that simultaneity of time, because both are true. And they don't always, in reality, necessarily cancel each other out. They're both happening at the same time. And in like the complexities of life, we don't always get to choose one or the other. You can be present with both of them, and then that's interesting.
Yeah, I guess I kind of had a similar, I guess how the emotional content kind of presented itself to me in a similar way too with this. I mean, in this novel, the towns happen to have these names, Elend and Sorge, so misery and sorrow, which is kind of a running gag in the book. But I guess it was important for me to look at these situations that people were living in this specific historical situation that was very constricting and, also involved a lot of trauma and a lot of pressure, living in a dictatorship, living with surveillance, but also realizing that people live in these very traumatic situations, but they still have, they still have their family, and they have a nice, they go on a nice walk and they enjoy the weather or their food or whatever. They have friendships, and it's, the way people experience their lives. When I went and talked to people who lived in this situation, they would always say, yes, it was a really crazy, messed up situation, but for us, it was normal. We went, we got used to it. We lived our normal lives in this crazy situation, which, was an experience. I think after, with COVID, we've, become accustomed to this. We've learned that you can live with in a very extreme situation, and you still have a certain kind of normality, and you still have your, positive emotions and so forth. And it was, it's interesting for me to try to capture these contradictions, as you say too, to realize that every moment has all these very contradictory emotions, and you can't necessarily put one word to it. You have to kind of write around it, or kind of convey it through different images that can convey these different facets of what people are experiencing.
Yeah, and I mean, they're just both wonderful to absolutely pick up and read. I'm interested as well because there's a translation that you did of Hilbig, Isabel, where the line that you translated is, I wrote for an utterly impossible reader, for one reader alone, and that reader was myself. I think it's such a beautiful line in the English translation as well. But how do you see your writing and the reader's experience? Do you think of the reader as you write? Do you think of necessarily one reader experience? Or do you really write based on this is the story that you need to tell that day? Or how do you think about its impact on the world receiving the stories and poems that you're writing?
Oh, is it? Sorry. I guess, yeah, for me, it's, I do kind of, I guess I write more for myself, or that just there's a sense there's a story that wants to be told, and, or, you know, maybe there's a kind of a problem that I want to work through, you know, how would people react in the situation? It's kind of more for me, I tend to kind of burrow into it, and you know, it takes me years and years before I even want to show anyone what I've been working on. So it's very much this long process of kind of working through this, sort of kind of creating this world and working things out in it, and you know, hopefully letting it have a life of its own. And then of course at some point I have to start thinking about, you know, and is, you know, and are other people, you know, aside from me, going to understand what I'm trying to say here? And then you have to kind of look at it with some distance, and you know, think about how certain things will come across. But for me, it's most of it is, I mean, the kind of the important work for me is just kind of thinking of the thing itself.
I agree. This is also my experience. I write for myself first, and then I decide, and I don't necessarily think of readers. I decide later who the readers will be, which will be determined by where the poem finds a home in publication. And so, and then, you know, the poem comes itself demanding certain things and pulling this and that. And sometimes I'll look and I'll say, what is this thing? You know, I don't understand this. If I don't understand it, nobody else will. And then the decisions I make along the way through various drafts and revisions and final editing will help sharpen that focus. And sometimes I will eliminate lines or stanzas, or decide not to go in a certain direction, because I think with how the poem, the container that the poem has come in, its form, is going to be too challenging within that form to get something across to people who may not have been there through the entire process and development of it. So it'll at some point be informed by a general reader, but only towards the very end, towards final editing, and it'll be about comprehension. And that's it, not anything else other than that very finite consideration.
And I also love the fact that it's okay to get lost in it, especially if it's bilingual, that the reader might not know what every line is, right? And that's part of what's happening within the story itself. But I think both of your works reflect this separation and this disjoint, and even sometimes distance that we often talk about in terms of physical space. It's also been brought up, this is the time, especially in Isabel's novel, that time is kind of much more fluid. It's kind of sometimes hard to put your foot in exactly where you're located a little bit more. But I'm interested in then is you often center, so in the novel we have Thomas, who's kind of our central character, and Naomi, in a lot of your poetry, you have this he voice that comes through, and there's that, you know, that very famous, I think, poem at the end of the packet about, see if I can even read the entire poem here. It's only a couple lines. It's called Men, he says, we're guilty of everything. Right. And I'm very interested in this very masculine he that appears in your work. So I'm interested a little bit more about how you found Thomas as the central character of the Green Frontier, or maybe Naomi, if you could talk about this he voice that you've thematized in a lot of your poetry.
Should we start with Isabel?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, well, with me, it was just, I had this constellation of characters. So there was going to be this couple, and I knew that the wife was going to be a sculptress. That was important. And then the husband was going to be a writer. And then it was just kind of natural for him to be the protagonist, who's kind of an outsider in this little village and is trying to kind of make sense of the situation he's in and is trying to write about it. So he was kind of, in that particular constellation, he happened to be the one that kind of presented himself as a protagonist for me to kind of take his perspective as an outside perspective and as someone who's kind of consciously reflecting on, how do I make sense of this crazy situation I'm in here right next to the border in this messed up dictatorship, and kind of trying to find some way to write about it. So he just happened to be the character that was kind of the obvious perspective to take as, the narrative perspective. And so I just kind of went with that. And then I did find it interesting to kind of, try to think my way into a male perspective. But I didn't really, it wasn't kind of a programmatic, I wasn't sort of picking a man for whatever reasons of identity, but I just, I don't know. And I also, for me, it's just, I'm not sure that I find it easier to think my way into a female figure than into a male figure, because, I don't understand, I understand women just as badly as I understand men. They're all just, people are all very different. And I think this kind of assumption that you automatically can identify with someone who shares your quote unquote identity, it can be kind of, it can lead you to make assumptions that maybe aren't correct. But anyway, I found it interesting to work with a male character.
And for me, this poem in particular is from a manuscript, recent manuscript that explores gender roles. And so in all the other thematic concerns that I explore in my work, but specifically long suites of poems focused on gender roles from different perspectives. And so this is, this is the briefest poem I have ever written, and I have some that would almost rival it. But it just, it completely got to this person's perspective, period. And this is something straight out of his mouth. So, yeah.
Yeah, I reflected on that poem for a very long time. I think it's poignant in a lot of different directions.
And it does very succinctly capture that, perspective of feeling accused and persecuted. And now, okay, everything about, in this case, being a straight male is wrong, is bad, and I can't do anything right. And it does, without elaborating on it.
Excellent. And I think we will probably shift now to a new mode. And I'll let you explain what's coming next.
All right. Yeah, I just wanted to let everybody who's tuned in know that the chat is open and Q&A is open as well. If you have any questions that you would like to share with Isabel and or Naomi. And yeah, Suzanne is back as well. So just thought I would let anybody who wants to jump in submit anything they'd like.
And I can continue to ask questions
Yeah.
too. I'm very interested too, as an American native speaker of English who is a professor of German, what unique perspective you think it might hold that you might come at a situation differently as if you had just been raised within that context the entire time. do you think it gives you a special insight into that culture, or what's kind of the advantages of the work we do?
It's kind of hard to say. I mean, it's what I'm doing. And, sometimes Germans will say, oh, you have an interesting approach to language but I can't really judge that myself. But I think sort of in the German political situation, I found that it was an advantage for me to write about East Germany as a total outsider. I mean, if a West German writes about East Germany, that really gets the East Germans' backs up, and maybe the other way around. But for me, I'm kind of coming out totally out of left field. So it kind of gave me the freedom to grapple with a lot of very fraught issues about East German history, and kind of get away with it. And also, I was kind of writing the situation that I'm writing about in the novel about people living in this sort of very direct border area is actually something that not a lot of East German writers have written about. I mean, I think also because it's a very traumatic experience, and I could just kind of blunder in and say, oh, this is really interesting. Whereas people who actually live through it, might find it harder to cope with, maybe with outlets, until they get more distance from it. So I kind of have the distance to kind of tackle certain subjects that I think for Germans themselves are more, they have maybe more complexes about it or something. And I was very fortunate that people were also open to how I dealt with it, and that I was dealing with issues that are not my own issues, but they accepted this. They were able to accept this outside perspective.
I wanted to jump in with, we have a question from G. Bernard, and I also had a follow-up question for both of you to this. Asks, will your, I think this is for Elizabeth, sorry, for Isabel. Will your books get translated into English, or rather, do you have any intention, I guess, of translating your own books into English?
I guess, I mean, theoretically, I would be interested in this challenge of, seeing how I might deal with it, maybe rewrite things or take liberties with the translation. So I have translated these excerpts from them, but so far, there is not a publisher that has taken them on. So at the moment, it's, I don't know if that will happen. And, also I'm not sure that I would at this point want to take the time to do that myself, because I'm kind of moving on to other things, but we'll see.
Yeah, and on that, my sort of question that I thought of when I saw that one, that I was kind of forming in my head throughout this was, so like over the weekend, I went to go see Steven Spielberg's version of West Side Story, and he made the decision, because there are Puerto Rican characters speaking Spanish among each other, and he made a decision to have pretty lengthy parts of the dialogue in Spanish only, and not translate it, subtitle it in English. And he made a statement about that. And he said that he did not want, first of all, he didn't think it was necessary, because he thought that the actors in there emoting and sort of, the other things could provide context that helped non-Spanish speaking audiences understand what was happening anyway, which as a non-Spanish speaker, it was perfect. And then also he said that he did not want to give English that sort of power over the language that was kind of, and I think especially in his way of saying that, he meant specifically the way that the US, their colonial sort of relationship to Puerto Rico. And I guess my greater idea about that, ever since I sort of was watching that movie and thinking about that interview, was, generally when people look at translation from a language into English, they look at marketability, like there's that question of like, oh, well, it gets translated into English so that it can be sold in an English speaking market. But is there do either or both of you have any thoughts about, like, is there a power to keeping something only in that language? Another example is kind of like, I'm just for fun learning Yiddish right now, and there's a lot about Yiddish that is very much like, it stays in Yiddish because there's that culture about like, we don't want other people to know what we're saying, and I don't know. I was wondering if either of you had any thoughts about that. Like there is that there's kind of like a other reasons beyond marketability for not wanting to translate something into English.
For me, absolutely. And, I think that's such a fabulous choice. I'm so heartened to hear this because even 5 or 7 years ago, I can't see something like this happening. And that somebody would have the courage to do that. But it does. I consider my first political act when I came to the United States, the choice to preserve my language, no matter what happened to me, under whatever circumstances, that I will retain my fluency, no matter what. And, I came here to meet relatives I had never met before who couldn't speak a word of Spanish. And I was so confused by that. I couldn't understand that. So for me, it is a part of one's cultural identity. So yeah. Isabel?
Yeah, I guess as a translator, I would never say that there are things that shouldn't be translated or that should only stay in their original language. But I also think that it's, a problem if everything is so focused on the English language market, and this idea that, especially, also on an international level, that English is the goal to which everyone aspires. I mean, I've had countless Germans asking me, oh, why do you write in German? If you wrote in English, you could sell so many more books. And I'm kind of thinking, well, it's not like I'm going to write a bestseller one way or the other. So what difference does it make if I'm, for me, it's more important to be working in this, to be active in this community that I live in, which is the German language community, and to be participating in that. And this idea that, if I were translated into English, I would have, I could have 10 times as many readers. It's just very abstract and kind of I'm kind of more, I don't have the ambition to have 20 million readers. I'm interested in kind of engaging with a community and of course reaching people, and I would love for my books to be translated, but for me it's kind of more important to have this immediate this immediate engagement with the community I'm living in, rather than this kind of idea of being famous and selling millions of books. It's kind of I don't really aspire to that necessarily.
Shall we wrap up? Do we have any? Amanda, do you want to take it and as sort of, do you have any like final questions? Because I know you prepared like a wonderful list of questions. So it's like, I think you'd be a good person to sort of take any last questions that we can go with.
I'll see if I can tie up one nice question in a bow, because we've talked so much about language. I'm also interested about the absence of language. So that moment where everything's kind of lost in a poem, or the two characters haven't really understood each other in some way. There's been some type of falling out in terms of that. How do you see in your work kind of these misunderstanding, or these like, and you say this as a bilingual person, you're always trying to find words, whether it's in your first language or your second language, and you need the people around you to know that word too. How do you kind of transmit that in your literature? So when the words aren't coming, or when the characters need to have that inability to express themselves, how does this absence manifest itself as well?
Mm-hmm. For me, as a poet, I am lucky that, I can play with the space between the lines, which is, what people call in music, playing the notes that aren't there. And so, and I am nowhere near as good as I would like to be before my time on this earth ends. It is such a, it's an infinite space of playing and composition, but also, punctuation and those silences, a line break, a stanza break, suspending something where I've been doing that a lot in poems lately, in closings, suspending something in a part of the moment in time where it would not be a natural ending. And just leaving it for the reader there. Here you go. It's done. Here it is, but it's not done. What will you make of this? And so engaging, readers in that silence also, becoming themselves part of the composition or the act, the process of composition.
I think for me, I am very interested, especially in this book about things that people can't talk about, whether it's traumatic experiences, which German history has a lot of, or things that are taboo, which German history also has a lot of, or just things that are so complicated that they're kind of hard for people to articulate. And I think, if you come down to it, for me, it's if you spend all your time trying to put things into words, you very often have the feeling that most of, that it's actually not really possible to do that, with any kind of degree of perfection, or so there's always this consciousness of kind of trying to dig deeper and deeper and deeper for these words to describe what people are, feeling or whatever, and then not, there's always that thing that you can't put your fingers on. And so there are kind of a lot of moments in this book where the characters are kind of grappling with that.
Or they completely vanish.
Yeah, or they're,
Yeah.
yeah, that's the kind of the final conclusion.
Well, I'm going to go ahead and say thank you so much to Isabel Fargo Cole and to Naomi Ayala for joining us this afternoon in this conversation. It's been really wonderful to listen from my side, and also to jump in right at the end with questions and hear your all's thoughts on, yeah, especially these intersections of writing and language, boundaries, borders. That stuff is, yeah, it's been really nice to see this finally come to happen. That we've had it in the works for so long. And thank you also to Amanda Sheffer for moderating. You're always really great with coming up with these questions, for facilitating book club, and I knew that you would do just as great coming up with these questions for Zeitgeist. So thank you also so much. And also, yeah, thank you to Suzanne. And Suzanne, since you are the curator of Zeitgeist, and just to kind of put a peg in it, now that we've finally arrived at the end of this particular Zeitgeist cohort, which is nice, that we've been able to see it through to the end. I thought I would hand things over to you.
Well, thank you, and I'm just honored, and I just was so thrilled to be here and to listen and hear what everyone had to say. It was really a fulfilling conversation, and I'm glad we were able to bring everyone together. And just thank you, everyone, for your participation. Thank you, everyone who's attended. I hope you got as much out of it as I did, and I think we've recorded it, so it will be available beyond this space, which is a nice thing about these Zoom events, even though we lack the intimate personal connection. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. And yeah, thanks everybody for joining and for listening. And I hope that you all enjoyed as much as we did. And yeah, wish you all happy, safe, healthy end of the year and holidays and all of that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.